Welcome to Workplace Wake Up, your go-to podcast for practical employment law guidance. I'm Jennifer Shaw, the founder of Shaw Law Group, and I'm here to help HR professionals and leaders navigate the legal minefield of the modern workplace. Each week, we tackle real-world issues with clear advice and a little tough love. Let's get started. We are going to talk about a hot topic in California employment law right now, bereavement leave. All right, now what is bereavement leave? Bereavement leave is time off that an employee gets to take when they lose someone close to them, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be a family member, depends on how you define it in your policy. But the reality is bereavement leave is a little more complicated than you might think. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it here today. First of all, we've all heard of these situations if you haven't experienced them yourself. The employee comes to you and says, my Uncle John died and I need 5 days off. And then 2 months later, Aunt Pauline died and we need, a couple days off. And then Uncle John dies again, right? There's something weird going on there. Oh, no, that's a different Uncle John. So there's this whole component of bereavement leave where sometimes I think we're afraid to ask for documentation and clarification because we think, oh my goodness, they just lost someone. Like we don't want to be picking on them when they've lost someone important to them, which is obviously the right approach, right? To not pick on our employees anytime. But the problem is if you don't get the documentation from some employees, but you do with others, you're going to have a problem, all right? So understand that bereavement leave is emotional. Lots of people think it's simple, it's basic, they can understand it, they know what's supposed to be happening, but it's not about good intentions. It's not about trying to make sure that people got the time they needed. We literally have to comply with this new law. And it's not even new anymore. It's been around a couple of years, but it's an important one, and it's one that really confuses people. The bottom line is it's very technical. The bereavement leave law is very technical. And of course, it's also linked to a very emotional situation sometimes for the employee. Sometimes they lose someone who they were expecting to lose. Doesn't make it any better, doesn't make it any easier, but it will sometimes be less of a shock. Other times they've lost somebody out of the clear blue, right? So it can be a very emotional situation. And I think that's part of what the legislature didn't really understand when they passed this law was, look, people who are asking for bereavement leave have generally gone through something pretty tough. So we don't want to create too many obstacles. On the other hand, we don't want it to be so easy that people who are lying and cheating about losing somebody can get their time to do what they want to do, right, for bereavement leave. So what I want you to think about is this is really not simple. So do not come down on yourself if you're thinking, gosh, I don't think this is simple. I think it's tricky. Yeah, I think it's tricky too. All right, I really do. And there's this emotional component of it that has this legal overlay, which can really make for challenges in the HR universe. Like, how do I communicate with the employee? What do I communicate? What if they're screaming in the phone, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to sue you. Okay, well, now if I fire them, is that retaliation? How do I establish that? Now that we know that bereavement leave is emotional and it's confusing, let's talk about the legal requirements. First of all, you're supposed to give 5 days of bereavement leave, all right, for qualifying family members. And they have to take the time within 3 months of losing the individual who they are taking bereavement leave for, right? So if they lose their father, they have to take the bereavement leave within 3 months of losing their father. This is unpaid time, but you must allow your employees to use their accrued vacation, their sick leave, and their paid time off. You have to let them use it, all right? And I think this is interesting because for a lot of folks, we start thinking about abuse in this area, right? We think about, well, wait a minute, how was it that this person's Uncle John died twice in the same year. Well, maybe they have two Uncle Johns. Well, we certainly have the ability to check that out. But the idea is, let's just focus on what we know, right? Rather than putting ourselves in a situation where we're trying to track people down and trying to prove claims. You want to be as careful as you can in your policy explaining what bereavement leave is and how it works, and then you apply it consistently. That's going to be the tricky thing to do, is that you have to be consistent in what you're doing. Okay, so when we talk about bereavement leave, remember that we are also talking about time off generally, right? Because what happens is when somebody asks for bereavement leave, they're going to be away from the office. And there's no undue hardship here, right? If somebody says, I need bereavement leave, they get bereavement leave, right? They get their time. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of the areas where employers can get tripped up in this situation, okay? One of them is that we are documenting things that we shouldn't be documenting, right? So we're documenting things that, well, this is what she said happened, and I wouldn't check the court records, and it says that the death was 3 weeks ago, not 2 weeks ago. So I think she may have requested time off to be with the person who ultimately ended up passing away. There are all these things that you have to think about when you're trying to fairly give people the leave, but not allow it to be abused. Okay, so let's talk about the family relationships that are covered when we talk about bereavement leave. This is very broad, okay? It can be for the death of a spouse, a child, a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, a grandchild, a domestic partner, or a parent-in-law, okay? And of course, you can also allow, as the employer, an employee to take bereavement leave upon the death of any other person, right, who doesn't necessarily meet those requirements. So it's very broad. It's more broad than the Healthy Workplace, Healthy Families Act sick leave, more broad than the California Family Rights Act, more broad than the Family and Medical Leave Act, all right? Now, remember that for you to be eligible for bereavement leave, your employer just has to have 5 employees, and you have to have been employed for at least 30 days before taking the leave, okay? That's what's important. Now, do you have to take all your bereavement leave at once, all of your 5 days? No, you don't. You just have to complete it within that 3-month period after the death of the person for whom you're taking the leave. So you might take 3 or 4 days immediately and then 2 days a week off from work for the next, couple of months. And then maybe you are going to take a little bit more time under your discretionary leave policy that you may have with the employer. So the idea is you don't have to take it all in a lump sum of 5 days. Also remember, the 5 days is 5 days of your regular work schedule. So if you are working on average 10 hours a day, that's 5 10-hour days, okay? Now, this law has what's called job reinstatement, right? It has job protections. So it says that when you're done with bereavement leave, you get to come back to work, okay? Your employer can't discriminate against you because you requested bereavement leave or you took bereavement leave. And this means, you guys, that as an employer, we can't terminate, we can't demote, we can't suspend, or we can't take any other adverse action against an employee because they have used bereavement leave. That would all be protected activity, using this time off. And if we single them out and we treat them unfairly because of that, that is going to be discrimination potentially, maybe harassment, maybe retaliation. Now, this is a weird part of bereavement leave. Employees are limited to 5 days of leave for each person they lose. So when you're talking about how much time you get, if you lose 4 people covered by the definition of family member in bereavement in a 12-month period, you could get 20 days off. Okay. So it's per, I just hate using this word, but it's per death, right? Per loss. Now, does it negatively affect when you take bereavement leave? Does it negatively affect your eligibility for other types of leave? No. Remember, this is in addition to any other leave you might have. For example, under the California Family Rights Act, or the Family and Medical Leave Act, or pregnancy disability leave. Bereavement leave is just another type of leave that you're entitled to take as an employee, or that your employees are entitled to take. You obviously would be covered as well, as long as you're an employee. Now, remember, it's not going to be paid directly by the employer, but they have to let you use accrued time, okay? And that's important. So you can use time, sick leave, vacation, personal leave, any other types of leave. You can use that for this purpose, for the purpose of bereavement. Now, what about documentation? This ends up being confusing for a lot of employers. Can I ask my employee for proof of death? Can I ask them for proof that they were at the funeral? Like, what can I do here? You are allowed to ask. You have to be sure that you provide it as soon as you can, but you're not required to provide it before you begin your leave, okay? You have to provide it within 30 days of the first day of your leave. It can be a death certificate. It can be an obituary. It can be written verification of the death, the burial, or memorial service that's prepared by a mortuary or a funeral home or a burial society or a crematorium or a church, okay? And you have to keep that documentation confidential. As the employer, you can only release it if it's necessary to meet a legal obligation. Otherwise, you cannot release that information, even internally. Remember, this provision, this benefit, applies both to union and non-union employees. So union and non-union. And if you think that your entitlement to bereavement leave was violated in some way, the place to go is to file a complaint with the Civil Rights Department. That is who will help you figure out if, in fact, you've got a problem there on bereavement leave, right? Now, there are a couple of tricky scenarios that I want you to think about. First of all, what do you do if a person comes to you and says, hey, I lost my grandma 6 months ago and I want to take bereavement leave? Well, we know that you have to take your bereavement leave within 90 days of the triggering event, okay, within 90 days. So that's not going to work. 6 months isn't going to work. But imagine how you're going to feel in HR if somebody comes after 2 months and says, hey, my Uncle Johnny passed away. I call him Uncle Johnny, but he's really my grandpa. And I want to be able to take time off to grieve him. Okay, well, are you going to a funeral? No, the funeral already happened. Are you going to a burial? No, the burial already happened. I just need time off to grieve him. They're entitled to that time, as long as they're meeting that 90-day requirement. So a lot of employers found themselves in a bit of a pickle on that issue because they think, well, he already passed away. They've already had this service. Why would you get bereavement leave? You get it for any of the things we've talked about during that 3-month window. All right? Now, what about non-covered relationships? I come to you and say, my cousin, with whom I am very close, has passed away. And my grandmother needs me to help get things ready for the service, right? Or for the celebration of life. A cousin is not going to be covered under that list of familial relationships. You might decide to give the leave anyway. You might decide to put a line in your policy that says bereavement leave may be available for other relationships not described in this policy. Contact HR for further information. You may decide you want to give bereavement leave for some other loss of a family member that is not in the list that I just read you, right? Grandparent, grandchild, parent, spouse, etc. Another tricky thing here is, let's say an employee is on FMLA, California Family Rights Act leave, and they lose their parent, right? They're taking the leave to care for the parent ends up dying. Well, now they can't take any more CFRA leave or FMLA leave because that's for somebody who's alive. That's not for somebody who's passed away. So their FMLA CFRA leave is going to stop immediately. And then we have to decide, okay, what are we going to do now, right? How are we going to grant the bereavement leave at the tail end of the FMLA CFRA leave? You easily can. You just designate it. You just send them a letter. As you know, you recently let us know last Tuesday that your grandmother ultimately passed away. We're so sorry. We're sending you a plant. But in the meantime, of course, you can take your 5 days of bereavement leave. I think it really behooves us as employers to get people to take this time as quickly as we can. Otherwise, what I see happening a lot is a bunch of losses at the end of the year, right? Where I deal with clients. One client runs a credit union, and they had in their little branch, and I think it was Yolo County somewhere, so kind of near Sacramento, they had 35 people who called in at one time on one day saying they had lost someone important to them and they needed the time off. So you can't run a branch like that with 35 people. So you have to figure out, okay, it's not protected like the religious accommodation would be protected or disability accommodation would be protected. Yes, these employees are supposed to be entitled to take bereavement leave for sure, but you want to think about, how are we doing that? And how am I administering that? And what am I putting in the policy? And how do I want to deal with things like relationships that aren't covered, right? My ex-husband. What if I want to take time off when my ex-husband passes away because my children are devastated and I need to help them through it? Interesting question, right? It's not as clear as we would like in this area. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a good policy, though, and that you shouldn't be very clear about what your expectations are and what you are holding your employees accountable to. Because bereavement leave is one of those areas where people think there's a lot of abuse. And I think there is in some ways, where in states like California, where they can come in and take a nice big block of time, people may be wanting to do that. And you may have to grant it to them. But you want to be strategic about it. And you want to think about all the way back. What does your policy say? How are you training on this? How do you make sure managers and supervisors understand what they're supposed to be doing with bereavement leave? If you do all of that, it will be much less likely that you face a legal claim in this area. It just will, because you're going to be dotting your I's and crossing your T's. What you will see, I hope, from our little chat this morning is that the requirements are not all that intuitive. So if you think you can noodle it out and decide, okay, well, how's this going to work? You may not be able to do that because it's just not like that. It's not that kind of a scenario. You have to actually know the rules on this one inside and out. Okay, now, one more thing I want you to think about, which is this idea of discretion. A lot of times when we do things in the workplace, we think that we can make a one-off decision, right? We have the discretion to be able to decide, do we want to give bereavement leave? Do we not want to give bereavement leave in a particular case? How are we going to handle it? The problem is you need full compliance, not discretion, because full compliance will drive very consistent decisions. If you give people too much leeway and too much discretion in permitting bereavement leave, you end up creating a problem for yourselves because you've created this additional leave of absence that employees now feel that they are entitled to, which isn't the case, right? They still have to have lost someone who fits the familial relationship definition. But many times an individual will say, well, I just want what I'm entitled to, right? I'm entitled to my 8 weeks of leave. That's what I want. Well, that's not how it works when it comes to bereavement leave. There's very specific types of benefits. So, for example, the minimum is that 5 hours per week. And after that, the employees are on their own in terms of what they want to do with the need for leave and where they might take the leave. One of the things that's interesting is for vacation, for example, you can allow employees to use their vacation time, even if they didn't meet the notice requirements, but you can't do the opposite. If you're going to let somebody who's sick waive their spring break landing date because they're in a plane and they weren't at school, it's not going to work that way. You've got to be fair. You don't want compliance to be sort of run over by discretion, right? If somebody loses a qualifying family member, they've lost a qualifying family member. We have to figure out how to deal with that down the road. And that's really what's going to be important when we talk about these issues. So everybody, I know that was a lot to talk about with bereavement. It's really important. It's the source of a lot of potential abuse. So make sure you listen to the recording again if you're unclear, and make sure that you get the information you need for your policies. So thank you all for joining me here today. It's always a pleasure, and I appreciate you coming in today, and just let me know what else I can do to help. Go out there and do something nice for someone, everybody. I'll see you next week. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Workplace Wake Up. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your HR and leadership teams. For more insights, training programs, and legal updates, you can visit us at shawlawgroup.com.